Silence hung over the scarred plain like a verdict. The world had learned to measure terror in other people's breath, in the space between a fist and the face that should have met it. On this raw, wind-bitten ground that used to be a city, two ideas gathered their weight and readied themselves for argument. One was a doctrine of immutable will, a consecration of force, given by a god and sanctified by ritual, heavy as a mountain and steady as a glacier. That was Juggernaut, carved in red stone and driven by a covenant older than the cities that had risen and fallen in his wake. The other was an answer forged in laboratories of cruelty and inevitability. Doomsday, refined by death and resurrection, into a principle that treated mortality as an iterative problem. He arrived as a correction the world never invited. They had both been called to this place, not by chance, but because myth is meticulous. Rumors had followed Juggernaut across oceans, a colossus that doffs reason and refuses halt, an unassailable will that turned retreat into sacrilege. The earth remembered when he rolled. Buildings folded like paper, storms deferred their applause. Doomsday's tale arrived like a geological fault line. Civilizations told it as a cautionary litany. He had been born of pain and refinement, shaped by experiments that insisted on a single outcome, survival through adaptation. It was not just power the old scholars argued about. Philosophy had thrown itself into the breach between muscle and mind. One faction favored Cyttorak's dogma: permanence is power. If a thing can be made permanent by charm or covenant, then time and change cannot outmaneuver it. Juggernaut embodied this, a continuous predicate of unstoppable momentum. Against that, another faction whispered of dialectics, that history is not a procession of immovable monoliths, but a conversation in which each answer births its own rebuttal, that becoming contains an asymptotic cruelty toward any claim of finality. Observers of a higher order, celestials and entities that measured suffering the way cartographers measure coastlines, watched with the cautious hunger of scholars who know when an experiment becomes holy terror. They placed prophecies like chess pieces, not to control but to see what answer reality would insist upon. In private alcoves they debated, is an unstoppable force a metaphysical constant, or is it merely a high order of contingence? If Juggernaut is the line that will not be crossed, must the world rearrange itself for it? Or will history find a seam in that law? Doomsday was not a thinker, and Juggernaut was not a philosopher. They were, however, embodiments of answer. One answer was the sanctity of an oath. The other was the sanctity of survival by any means. The philosophers argued in abstract, and the ground below the arguing groaned as if the debate had waked. At the center of the plain, a crater like a wound exhaled ash as if the planet itself were clearing its throat for testimony. In the nights before the clash, the wind carried anecdotes. Survivors who had scraped along the margins of either monolith told stories that became parables. A man who had worked with the remnants of Juggernaut's followers said that Cyttorak's power was less a tool than a covenant. It conferred not only force, but a metaphysical destiny. Another who had crawled out of the ruins left by Doomsday spoke of cycles, of each resurrection arriving with a small correction, as if the creature were tuning itself to the world's complaint. The question that obsessed the thinkers was not merely who would win. It was why either could claim victory in principle. Would an essence that refused to change bend the universe to its law? Or would relentless adaptation find a seam in that logic? There was elegance in both possibilities. Stasis promised a clean answer. Permanence crushes novelty. Becoming promised complexity. Change transfigures certainty. Even the animals fled. The sky was a bruise, the sun reluctant, and yet a human walked the perimeter, a philosopher, or perhaps a fool, who wanted to witness the conversation in its rawest grammar. He had spent his life translating violence into propositions, believing that the way a thing fought revealed its metaphysics. He carried no weapon. He carried only questions and a willingness to be wrong. When Juggernaut arrived, the land sang in syllables of stone. He was an altar that became footfall. The air around him seemed to obey a different set of rules. Inertia bowed to it. It was like watching a law of physics become jealous. Doomsday did not announce himself. He was a rupture in silence, an answer delivered in limbs. He moved like something that had learned the world by rubbing itself against it until it fit. Where Juggernaut represented the assertion, Doomsday was the retort that multiplied by attrition. They paused at a distance, as if manners could make a difference. Neither needed civility. The philosopher who had come to watch found himself listening to a debate he could not understand. It was not carried in words, but in the insistence of presence, in the way the grass carved itself underfoot, in the way birds forgot their song. That was the argument. For Juggernaut, the proof would be the demonstration that nothing could stop him. For Doomsday, the proof would be survival and improvement under the direst of punishments. As the first light of dawn filtered through a sky still tender with bruises, they advanced. Neither paused for breath nor prayer. The plain became a stage where metaphysics could collide in flesh and bone. The philosopher put down his questions and watched, his heart a drumbeat counting the syllables of a sentence he was not yet capable of finishing. The argument had given way to action. The world held its breath, because in a moment, the universe would have to choose which logic would wear the crown of fact, the unyielding law or the adaptive engine that eats finality for breakfast. Began without sound. Momentum is a thing that belongs to the body, but impact is a judgment that belongs to the world. Juggernaut moved like a verdict rendered by a god, the ground folding beneath him, the air choking on the insistence of his advice. Doomsday answered like a principle of nature returned to the vote, limbs as raw argument, teeth and bone, and fossilized fury. For a long, breathless span, the only difference between them was intention. Juggernaut's was to crush, Doomsday's to persist. They struck, and the first ring of contact was a redefinition of geography. Concrete became dust, the horizon bowed, and temperature itself seemed to re-evaluate manners. Juggernaut's first strategy was blunt, to end the conversation by obliterating the interlocutor. He poured consecrated kinetic will into each blow, and those blows should have finished any other thing. Doomsday took them, and paid the price. He bled and tore and collapsed. And then, as was terrible and inevitable, he rose renewed. Each resurgence bore a correction, a small calibration in bone, tendon, or neural knot that made him less vulnerable to the very strike that had felled him. What the philosopher had once considered theoretical became grimly practical. Death was a teacher in Doomsday's curriculum. Juggernaut, by contrast, relied on doctrinal purity. Every strike was backed by Cyttorak's sanction. Every attempt to remove motion from the field was a ritual of exclusion rather than mutation. He attempted at first to demonstrate superiority by decree. Smash and the world would accept the result.
Doomsday answered not with logic, but with method. He absorbed the consequence, transmuted it, and then delivered it back in a new dialect. The clash escalated. Juggernaut summoned the sanctity of his patron, and struck not merely with strength, but with the metaphysical equivalent of a binding. He crafted wards of anti-motion and edicts of stasis. For an instant it seemed as though the world itself would fold into silence and hold Doomsday like a relic. Doomsday broke. The plane conceded for a heartbeat, but the defeat was not a termination. It was a lesson stored in sinew. He returned, and the new iteration of him did not merely resist the ward. He integrated its logic into his anatomy. What had been a legal architecture intended to deny movement became template material for bone to form around. Juggernaut then attempted something desperate and elegant. He tried to excise Doomsday from the field of possibility by banishing him into a vault of paradox, an anti-motion prison wrought by Cyttorak's rights. It was a trap of metaphysical geometry, rather than brute force. For a time, the vault held. Doomsday's body was sealed, and the world dared to believe in a tidy conclusion. But when Doomsday returned, he returned with the prison's map clinging to his marrow. He had, in effect, learned the prison's grammar, and made that grammar part of the new sentence his flesh could speak. The fight shape changed. What had seemed a contest of who could hit harder became a dialectic of change versus decree. Juggernaut's blows remained brilliant and unbending, perfect instiations of immutable will. Doomsday's answers became iterative masterpieces of survival.
each iteration exploiting a previous assumption in Juggernaut's doctrine. In time, the philosopher watching began to understand that the argument read like an old text. Permanence is admirable and terrifying, but it does not account for an opponent that treats finality as a resource. The contest reached its apex when Juggernaut, in a fury that was also a liturgy, unleashed an invocation meant to be decisive, a stroke intended to dissolve Doomsday from the ledger of return. The sky convulsed with the weight of the blow. The world received it as if it were being edited. Doomsday shattered into ruin. For a moment the philosopher could not breathe. The pact of Cyttorak seemed vindicated. Then the silence folded, and something in the plane moved that had not been counted. Doomsday came back not as a mere repeat, but as an exception. The universe grudgingly allowed. He had absorbed the Decisive Strike's logic and rendered it inert, not by negating Cyttorak, but by changing the terms under which Cyttorak operated in their local encounter. Power that cannot change can be brilliant, but brittle. Power that is willing to sacrifice itself to become is inexorable. Juggernaut found himself facing an opponent who had learned to let finality function as fuel. Each ceremony of force that sought to freeze the contest instead became an ingredient in Doomsday's becoming. When Juggernaut finally fell, and fall he did, there was no jubilant chorus, no theatrical coronation. Doomsday stood enormous and rent, the living proof of an answer the philosophers had suspected, but could not concede without pain. That adaptation triumphs over absolute decree when the cost of adaptation is precisely what the decree assumes will finish it. The earth bore scars that would remember both. Survivors would tell the tale as myth, because it was a morality play about concrete truths, about stasis and change, about the price paid for insisting on being unchangeable. Juggernaut's fall became a lesson about the arrogance of absolutism. Doomsday's survival became evidence that the engine of reality is not the law that refuses altercation, but the process that incorporates and transforms it. The philosopher knelt, not to celebrate but to take notes on the grammar of victory. He had come seeking an answer to who was stronger, and left with a deeper, more dangerous lesson. Inevitability is not only a thing that crushes, it can also be a thing that learns how to wear any armor the world offers, and in wearing it turns armor into flesh.